absolutely beautiful spring day in Albuquerque. My name is Amanda Sutton. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 36-year-old independent bookstore. We're located down in the North Valley, the Rio Grande River Valley of North Albuquerque. You can find us open from 9 to 4 starting next week, Tuesday through Saturday for in-store browsing. Please do bring your mask. Masks are still required. You can also bring your furry friend because we are dog friendly and dogs are allowed back in the shop too. Always helpful and helping you make your bookstore purchases, those furry friends. All right, well, thank you all so much again for joining us today. We're very pleased to be back for another virtual event with our wonderful partners, the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Valerie Martinez, the Director of History and Literary Arts over there, has been helping us out on many an event. This is virtual event number 102 for me during the pandemic from my home office, which is in Victory Hills over by UNM. Feel free to tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat. You can also type your questions in there if something comes to you. We're excited to be speaking with Richard and Shirley Flint, longtime authors who typically cover topics like colonial Mexico and Coronado. Today, we're here for a very different topic, a fascinating and fun one that may have some of you train buffs tuning in. We're here to talk about Albuquerque's locomotive repair shops, the social history thereof, the people who worked there. I know it's going to be a fascinating talk, so we'll get right into it here. Again, please type any questions you have in the chat. We will get to those at the end of the talk. I will also put links in there for book buying. Feel free to purchase a copy of Overhaul, the latest and greatest from the University of New Mexico Press. Consider buying it from Bookworks. That's how we keep these events going, this event train, so to speak. If you can't buy it from us, buy it from your local independent bookstore. Okay, thanks again, everyone. If you're just tuning in here, my name is Amanda. I'm with Bookworks Albuquerque, a 36-year-old independent bookstore. Valerie Martinez over the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Thank you so much for joining us to talk to Richard and Shirley about Overhaul. How are you doing, Val?
I'm doing great. Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Amanda said, my name is Valerie Martinez, and I'm the Director of History and Literary Arts at the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, USA, if you're joining us from far away. In a few moments, I'm going to introduce our authors, but I first want to give a big thanks to Amanda and Bookworks and to Bryce Emily and the University of New Mexico Press for collaborating with us at the NHCC for this event and a series of book events since the fall of 2020. As you all know, we usually, all of us have in-person events, and we pivoted quickly, and I talked to Amanda and Bryce and I said, let's do a series together. Let's make it virtual. And they have been wonderful. And this is the last kind of in that series. I'm so grateful to them. And today we're also collaborating with the Wheels Museum, and I'm very grateful for all the good work that they do. The National Hispanic Cultural Center is dedicated to the preservation, promotion, and advancement of Hispanic culture, arts, and humanities, including the literary arts. It's our pleasure to host events that celebrate books by and about the Hispanic Latinx experience. In this case today, the Albuquerque and Barelas communities and their history with the railroad. The NHCC is located in the Barelas neighborhood of Albuquerque, so today's topic is particularly important to us. Barelas is our home. So we'll get started. Our general format today is to talk about the book. I have a list of questions after reading it. Here's this beautiful cover, and I really encourage you all to buy the book. I'll talk about why, but it's just full of amazing information and beautiful photographs that, just really made it an interesting journey for me. So I want to start by introducing Richard and Shirley. Both Richard and Shirley Cushing Flint came to New Mexico in the middle 1960s to attend St. John's College in Santa Fe. Both hold master's degrees from New Mexico Highlands University. Richard also received a PhD from the University of New Mexico in Latin American and US West History. The two have collaborated on research and writing projects for nearly 50 years. In 1980, a chance reading of a footnote in a late 19th century book decisively reoriented the focus of their historical research. Since then, the Flints have published 8 books and scores of articles on the Coronado expedition of 1539 to 1542 and related topics. While finishing up their most recent of those books, titled A Most Splendid Company, The Coronado Expedition in Global Perspective, UNM Press 2019, another chance encounter led the Flints to take a break from the 16th century. Liba Fried, director of the Wheels Museum on the grounds of the old Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe locomotive repair shops, asked if they might be willing to write something about the shops. That something turned into a full-fledged project that resulted in April of 2021 in the publication by UNM Press of the book that we're going to talk about today. Overhaul, a social history of the Albuquerque locomotive repair shops, is based on 4 years of research by the Flints that draws on a wide variety of historic sources, including interviews with former shop workers and their descendants, memoirs, contemporaneous travelers' accounts, land titles and property records, census and city directory data, maps and plats, contemporaneous photographs, AT and SF business records and payrolls, as well as monographs and articles by professional historians on subjects related to locomotive repair work and events in late 19th and early 20th century Albuquerque. The result is an engaging and thorough account of the shops and the people who worked there and their decisive role in the formation and development of Albuquerque. So if you would all join me in giving the Flints a very warm welcome, and you can raise your hands like me with applause, even though you are muted for right now, so that we can get started. And so I have many, many questions, but I just wanted to start to give you some time to say hello and talk a little bit about, for me, what was surprising to you as you undertook all this research? What did you discover that really sort of changed the way you think about the subject? So welcome.
Thank you. Do you want to go first?
You go first.
Okay. I think there are so many things that were fascinating about doing research on the locomotive repair shops. As we've been in New Mexico a long time, we've been in the Albuquerque area for a good portion of that time, and have driven by the shops, what remain of the shops, the major architecture of the shops, countless times, never thinking really anything about it. And I think one of the things that was surprising to us in doing the research was how few people we encountered who had any particular even knowledge, let alone memory, of the shops and how important they were to the city of Albuquerque. Most people that we talked to, except those who were related to people who actually worked there or worked there themselves, really had no idea that Albuquerque would not exist as a city as it is today without the shops. The shops were for nearly 70 years the principal employer in not only the city of Albuquerque, but the state of New Mexico. They were by far the biggest employer for years and years and years. And I think that was probably the number one sort of opening surprise was that it was so important and yet so much forgotten.
And another thing that was very fun was talking to the children of people who work there. And they too, they were as surprised as we were, even though their father or grandfather or both worked there. They had really no idea what went on there. Like most kids don't know what their parents really do. So it was fun for them to read that. We've had many comments about, I had no idea basically what their dad or father or uncle or grandfather did all day. So that was actually fun to be in the same boat they were. Like we didn't either.
The shops were in fact closed. They had locked gates. Only employees were allowed in, except on one day a year, family was allowed to come see what their family members, where they worked. And even then, it was not really being able to see the work happen, because it was also way too dangerous to have a whole bunch of family members milling around in a place where there are all kinds of sparks flying and shavings and hot metal, and you name the danger, it was there at the shops. All kinds of solvents and chemicals. So literally, families never saw what their parents did at the shops. Because the shops were oriented, and still are, the property still is oriented between the neighborhoods of Bareilles and San Jose or South Broadway, depending on how you look at it. And there was a locked gate on each side. We talked to people, now adults, now elderly adults even, who were children in the day. They didn't go across the shop land. They didn't know what was on the other side of the shop land. It was impenetrable. It was a 28-acre parcel that was just completely off limits to them. And that was even continued by the station for the trains where they came in. So there was even more of that area that was sort of forbidden. It was off limits to them. So there was this no man's land for them, between them and other people of their same age even, that they didn't know, because they were just a few hundred yards away, but they lived on the other side of the shops.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. There's some wonderful sections in this book where you talk about how dangerous, and I want to get to those, but I want to go back a little bit to the beginning, what you said, because there's a section in the book, and just tell me if I don't remember correctly, but you talked about the railroad was going to make an agreement, I think, with, is it Bernalillo, right? It would have bypassed what was Albuquerque, which was an agricultural community. So the story of it coming into Albuquerque, right, there were other locations in the beginning. So I guess what I want to say is, before all this happened, right, Albuquerque was an agricultural community sort of concentrated near the river. But can you talk a little bit about the route and how it ended up in Albuquerque, and where it diverted away from other places?
You mean like why it didn't choose Bernalillo? Or
Yeah.
I mean, because the route would be determined by engineers in the headquarters of the railroad, the most direct, easiest route. And they would just put it on a map and plow right through, like when they plowed through Santo Domingo Pueblo without permission. Just, that's my route and that's what we're doing. So when they came to Bernalillo, that was about the right place to have a shops in terms of how long a steam engine can go without repair. But where they wanted to put it, the landowner was asking too much money, so they just came down here to do it. So it was close enough to come down here and put the
Right.
shop.
So the route was going to be there, but where the shops would be.
Where the shops would be changing a little bit. But
and imagine that Bernalillo, if it had been Bernalillo would have been
like this,
the present day Albuquerque.
That's right.
Pretty much.
And the whole point of being in this general area, say Bernalillo, Albuquerque, Isleta, any of those places in effect would have probably been all right for them, because the major factor was water.
Right.
Doing locomotive repair and all that metal work that was involved used extraordinary amounts of water. And the largest source, easily available surface water source between Atchison, Kansas, and Los Angeles, California, well, barring the Colorado River when you get to California at Needles, was the Rio Grande.
Right.
And so all the water was extremely important to where they were going to put the shops.
Because they needed the water, because the equipment was run by steam also, not just the engines, but steam ran all the belts, all the equipment. So that's a lot of water required.
Yeah, I had numerous stationary steam engines in the shops powering all the power tools, these monstrous hammers that would hammer out gigantic push rods in the shops that actually run the locomotives. They had to beat these all out with these gigantic steam hammers, and that takes more and more water. So that was a major factor in the choice of location, the general location. Albuquerque was just, I think, lucky in having the final choice made of Albuquerque.
Well, some people think it's lucky.
Yeah, well, yeah, some people think it's not.
Some people didn't.
Others would say was not lucky.
Because
Sure.
Not to sort of extend your question, like the Borellis neighborhood, the whole time we've ever known it, it's a Hispanic neighborhood, and that's what it is. But to find out it didn't start out that way, that was an eye-opener. It's like, wow, it didn't know. It was very much people from the East, many immigrants, Germans, Swedes, people from Pennsylvania, people from New York, Ohio. They started that actual community as we know it. It was a little farming community, but didn't have all those row houses and all those streets until the railroad came and brought people from outside to live there. We had no idea about that. And then we, as you see in the book, we show how that got transformed to what we know.
Yes, because once the railroad came, once they put the tracks down, so there was no difference between, but wasn't called Bud Ellis then, right, and South Broadway. That was one agricultural community. Then the tracks came down, divided those communities. You don't shy away from how complicated that was, and we can talk about that as well. But then it sort of split those, and then you were talking about, then it created sort of except for the workers, a sort of no person zone there, right? Even the families couldn't visit. Created the shops that were isolated, in part, the book describes, because of it was dangerous. But then they had to dig canals to the river, right? They had to get the water to the shops, right, to the machines, basically. So it was a radical transformation of the landscape in order to just get the tracks down, get the shops there, get the water that they needed, and to begin the business.
Lots of other things that I think ordinarily we wouldn't think about were necessary for at least from the point of view of the railroad, were necessary. So there was a lot of denuding of vegetation in the Albuquerque area, a lot of cutting down of trees from the bosque, because they needed wood. They had to build corrals, because those trains, some of them were going to be carrying livestock. So they had to have places to have managed livestock immediately adjacent to where those trains would be. So that all of that went into it too. Cutting down trees to get the lumber to do two things. You needed lumber for the ties, for the actual railroad, the physical railroad, but then you also needed posts to corral animals and sometimes even people, guiding them how they moved in the landscape. And the place to get it was the bosque. So it meant cutting down a lot of the bosque.
And then, as you mentioned, people came, right, because of the business of the railroad. So you had migrants or transplants, as we call them now in New Mexico, which was very different population from the indigenous, right, and sort of Spanish population. It brought people from all over Europe. It brought Chinese, I'm assuming. You do say there weren't as many African Americans that worked in the shops in part of the book, because you do a detailed kind of breakdown of that. But it just brought people to the city.
And some of them are still here, of course. They remained. As time went on, as the shops declined, many moved on. Some people, when they came, didn't like New Mexico. Too hot, too dry for them. And so they never stayed very long. So it was transient with transients. And then, like I say, some of them have stayed here ever since.
Yeah. That one of the things that was true about the initial workforce of the shops was that the major positions that people filled at the shops were skilled positions. They required long amounts of training. In fact, the railroad required 4 years of apprentice training to become a journeyman, say, a machinist. And these were people who were machining all kinds of parts for locomotives, because locomotives in those days, steam locomotives, were manufactured in very small lots, usually only 6 to 12 locomotives per lot. And then the model would change. So that 12 maximum, and then you get a different model. It's like the proliferation of models of, well, lots of things, but electronic equipment we're familiar with these days. How, you'd suddenly get some small innovation and that would revolutionize the entire industry. Well, that happened with railroading, except that it's not so easy to throw away a locomotive. You have to keep using it. It's a very expensive piece of equipment. So you ended up with lots of different models having to be worked on by the workforce at any major shop, but Albuquerque was a major shop. So when things broke, there was no way to write to the manufacturer and say, send us a spare part for this locomotive. Forget it. There was no such thing. So the blacksmiths and machinists had to fabricate from scratch replacement parts. So they trained all their new apprentices in technical drawing, so because they had to be able to draw the parts that had to be prepared, that had to be made then from scratch. So it was a complicated thing. And it meant that when the railroad arrived in Albuquerque in 1880, first got here, they had to have with them those people who had the skills to maintain the locomotives. And there were not people like that in New Mexico, because there were no railroads in New Mexico until the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe arrived. So they had to bring with them the people who were capable of doing that. And that's why the initial workforce was so heavily people from the East and European immigrants, where steam locomotives had been in use for a long time. Therefore, there were already skilled workers there. But it excluded local people for a long time because of that.
Except in the lowest paid
Except
jobs.
in the lowest ranks.
So.
Right. And then I'm assuming that eventually, I don't know what the percentage was between the skilled engineers or whatever and the people just, working in those less well-paid or lower positions. But then as they became trained, did they rise up? Do those workers, the skilled workers from elsewhere, eventually leave, or did they stay, through the whole time?
Well, we have both things happening. some did not stay. Quite a few did not stay. They moved on
With
to
the
places
railroad
with the
itself.
railroad to other places that either they liked more or the railroad wanted them
So
more to
like
be somewhere else.
Barstow and San Bernardino, California, and then up to Richmond in the Bay Area. So sometimes they would basically be transporting this core group to the next repair shop that needed the very same workers. So some of them would be doing that, and some would stay here and train other people.
But it took a very long time, literally generations, for local New Mexicans who were here already when the railroad arrived to move into the level of journeyman skilled workers. Because there was, in addition to the fact of just requiring the skill, there was a consistent and national bias against Hispanics and Blacks and lots of foreigners of all kinds were really excluded from the higher ranks of working on most railroads, including the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. So it took, as a matter of fact, it took a strike in 1922 to change things. And there had been already a big strike of shop workers in the 1890s, and the shop workers had been successful, and the various railroads, and there were a large number of railroads that existed, swore that they would never let that happen again. They would never let those shop workers win in a strike. And when the next large strike happened, which was 1922, the railroads were ready. Not only were they ready, but they had enlisted the power of the U.S. federal government. So there were Army was called out. As with all the strikes of those days, Pinkerton agents, things like that, to prevent, to protect basically scabs who would be hired so that the union members could not work. They would not allow them to work. They shut them out, locked them out, so that there was a great deal of animosity between the railroads, largely in the US, and the various railroad unions, including the shop crafts unions. And when that strike began to wane and they were hiring back people, they specifically did not hire back people who had gone out on strike. So a whole lot of people lost jobs. Well, one of the beneficial things for local New Mexicans was they had been working, generally speaking, at the lower levels of pay and theoretically skill, but that really didn't have much to do with it. Pay did before the strike. So many of them knew perfectly well how to do all the jobs that journeymen machinists and boilermakers and all the various skill positions knew how to do, but they just weren't officially journeymen, and so they didn't get paid. So one of the results then, as the strike ended, was the railroad hired on, because they weren't unionized, they hired on local New Mexican workers, and it completely transformed the shops. In the matter of just about 6 years, the shop workforce went from being dominantly European immigrant to at least slightly majority local Hispanic.
Oh, that's just fascinating, isn't it? Because we just think of unions as inclusive in some ways. Now
that's right, but no, the unions were equally biased.
Wow.
So it was not beneficial to the local New Mexico population.
Did unions originate with railroad workers, or did they exist? So this is sort of outside of the book, but I wonder that question, if a union sort of originated with the railroad industry.
Well, in
No.
Europe, they had something called guilds, and it's in effect a union. You
Yeah.
had to do certain things, some of them very secret, to learn how to do goldsmithing. It's very, very old, centuries old. So that system was in place other places.
And people were actually sworn to secrecy who had attained the knowledge of the skill. They were forbidden to reveal the details of their work to other people, so that because they didn't want it spreading just willy-nilly among everybody. This was supposed to be limited to people who had been trained in the system.
Interesting. Because in some ways that fed into that who is privileged and not. And so the strike actually ended up democratizing to some degree, right? And allowing workers of color to earn a better salary. But it prevented the kinds of good things that sometimes unions secure for workers, which have to do with safety, right? And you have whole sections in the book that refer to how dangerous. You have a great picture, which basically for those of you watching has the front, I think it's the front of a train that's just exploding in wires from an explosion. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what kinds of safeguards were there for the workers, or what kind of recourse if there was an explosion. Or
well, in the shops they have this, it's in the book, a photo of a cute little guy running around he has a wrench in his hand, about be careful. What's his name? I forget.
Accident. His name was Accident.
And so it's everywhere. And they have a meeting once a week, sort of a refresher kind of thing.
Safety.
They would keep track, like you see places where they say we've had 365 days without accident. You see that. They would do that to, encourage people, like we're going for 400 or whatever. But they'd have a meeting every week. But still, they had things happen, bad things. And they also, to help this was a worker benefit, that the railroad then had a hospital built for their employees, which is now a hotel, but in town. But it was the railroad hospital. So in a way, the corporation itself realized they needed healthy workers, and they were willing to put money up for that. Mm-hmm. But some of the horrendous stories, right, of what happened to some people.
There was an interesting, unpleasant story that one of the relatives of a man who worked at the shops in the 1930s and 40s, had gotten crosswise with a supervisor, and who just didn't like him, and he would pick on him and do lots of sort of mean things to him. Well, one day the supervisor required this man to lift up this about 300-pound iron object, and as a result, he got a hernia, a fairly severe hernia, and was so afraid to even reveal that to anyone that he worked the rest of his career for the railroad in that condition until he retired, and then he could go to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe hospital and have the hernia repaired.
Oh.
Because he was so afraid he would be fired if he let anybody know that he had this problem. And it's so, I mean, I think the stories are just, they're awful ones. Things were very dangerous. There were pieces of metal flying around all the time, hot welds. Minor injuries were just a daily occurrence, and more major ones were frequent. And the railroad published a monthly magazine for employees of the railroad. And one of the sections in the every month's magazine was a thing about just sort of statements of what had been going on at the various locations along the railroad. Well, frequently the information that was being passed along was that somebody had been injured and had to go into the hospital because of, for instance, dropping something heavy on their foot, or having a pounding on a bolt to try and get the nut loose, to get it out of its socket so it could be replaced, and the thing shatters, and about the only protective equipment that was available were goggles. And in this particular case that I am thinking about, the fragment of metal that was released by this blow actually broke the goggles and injured the man's eye very, very, very badly. And so I had to go to the hospital. And, there would be many times when the result would be that they weren't coming back to work.
Yeah.
The injuries were that severe.
Well, a couple more things, and then I do want to open up for questions, because I'm guessing I have so many questions that our audience is going to have questions. So maybe two things is, one is if you could talk about the end, what happened when, how it ended, and what the lasting effects are, you think, on the community, maybe positive and negative, in terms of Albuquerque as a result.
Wow, I think that one of the most amazing ones for us were realizing that the positive impact was basically transforming many Hispanic families from rural situations, even as far south as Belen and Los Lunas, and probably that's about as far, and up even Bernalillo, from agricultural activities to first in the shops, so industrial, but then into professional classes in 2 generations. So from the farm to the shops to college, we have a Supreme Court justice, we have professionals of all kinds, lawyers, dentists, teachers. I mean, that is just an amazing story, just that itself. It only took 2 generations to transform a whole lot of local Hispanic families.
And was that related mostly because of sort of upwardly mobile education?
I think partly the money, right? They started getting real money. And I think it had to have been partly the shop people saying that the future is you need to go to college. I mean, we need to send our children to college to take real advantage of everything. And so, some people end up at Sandia Labs, some of them doing the same kind of high tech activities because they came out of the shops. But I just found myself that was just a cool story. And when we mentioned it, like we were talking to, Judge Baca, and he hadn't really, I had to ask him, this is amazing. From farm to shop to you're the Supreme Court justice. This is amazing. He hadn't really thought that through. Like, yeah, maybe that is kind of amazing.
or that it was certainly not to that extent, but that transformation was in essence familiar and common. Not that every family that was involved in working in the shops did that, but I think it's surprising the number that did make those transformations. And I think there were other things that helped out along the way. For instance, things like World War II made a difference. World War I also made a difference because it just took people into different situations where they were required to have other kinds of skills. And so that helped also. But I think that the just employment by the railroad was steady. It was well paid for the time and place, and could be counted on from one generation to the next. We have so many cases of fathers getting jobs for their children at the shops, and then those people getting jobs for their children at the shops. And that was sort of abetted in a way by a hiring practice of the railroad. They liked having, if you had a family member who was already considered to be a good employee of the railroad, then you had a very high possibility of getting a job with the railroad.
Right.
That kind of thing. So in effect, once it got started, once the chain sort of got started, it increased the employment of, say, Hispanics in New Mexico by the railroad. And then you get more and more people who are getting these better incomes, who have these alternative options offered to them. And so it starts to feed on itself, basically, as one generation improves their education, and the railroad itself was not averse to that. They used to boast about their employees being innovators, because there were constant changes being made to steam locomotives. The technical journals of the day were just absolutely chock-a-block with inventions that had been made by employees at railroad shops throughout the United States, and spelling them out in detail, having technical drawings of these new inventions, sometimes just improving how a bend in a tube went. That to that kind of detail, so that they were actually being encouraged to be innovative, to learn more, even outside of their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sort of went hand in hand with the situation of people having better incomes, and education being highly valued, so that what you would think happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. I just want to sort of conclude this segment by thanking you and giving you applause. And I think Amanda is going to help us through Q&A, because I see that there's questions in the chat. But
Yeah, I see there.
Thank you so much. I've just learned so much about that. In addition to reading the book, I really hope all of you will buy the book. Amanda?
Okay, we have a question from Lou Reynolds. Lou wants to know if you discussed the fire station that was on the premises, saying, my father worked in the shops as well as the fire station.
We can definitely say things about the fire station. One of the
We didn't in the book very
we
much.
didn't really talk about it in the book, although I think there's a plan of the layout of the shops that shows the fire station, and the building, the original fire station building, actually still exists on the property. It hasn't been a fire station for a long time, but because there was so much heat involved in the work of rebuilding locomotives, there were so many chemicals involved, there was always the possibility of fire. And fire was a real danger. That was one of the more common things that would happen to locomotive repair shops everywhere in the world, was they would catch fire and burn down.
And the original shops were wood, had a wood frame, wood roofs. And that fire station that you see in red sandstone down there is from the original shops, still standing. So its function had a real function then. And when they switched to what we see now, steel and glass, it would have less of a function, although it operated as a fire station for the neighborhood too, for quite a long time.
Yeah.
All right, great. A couple of quick questions about dates. Lou also wanted to know if you could tell us about the year of the strike.
Well, the strike that transformed the Albuquerque shops was 1922, although that's only the official date. It's when it started. It ended very sporadically across the country. In Albuquerque, it ended quite quickly. And we, although we don't have firm evidence, we have, we think that the reason it ended so rather quickly in Albuquerque was that Albuquerque was also a division point on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. And that meant that there were a lot of executives in Albuquerque, railroad executives. So they were really sort of top heavy on executive workers, which tended to tamp down the union activity, so that when the strike did happen, it was about 1,000 people from the Albuquerque shops went out on that first day of strike in July of 1922. But by fall, things were back running again in Albuquerque. In other parts of the country, some of the shops did not reopen for 4 or 5 years. So it went on and on and on and on elsewhere. But so to say when the strike was is a little tricky. But as far as Albuquerque is concerned, it was basically 1922.
Okay, and then when were the shops finally closed? That's a question coming in from Monty Avery.
Well, that's also
Close,
complicated.
You
Yeah.
could give the close date.
Okay, this is sort of the final closure, which is actually the very early 1980s. But that's has a big asterisk because they had not been working on steam locomotives, which was the purpose of the Albuquerque shops. They were built to service steam locomotives. And that ended in 1955. The very last steam locomotive was retired from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad in 1955. And that was sort of a result of World War II. When
They moved to diesels.
They moved to diesel electric locomotives, which is what they still use primarily.
But they kept the shops to work on some of the repair equipment that would go out on the line and work on the, various odd railroad things, the rails, the ties, the change boxes. And they had equipment to do that. So it stayed open to repair that kind of equipment, a very much reduced force.
Yeah, very much reduced.
And when we came, they were still open. They were still working in the shops. Little did we know, but they were there doing that kind of stuff.
But these mammoth architecture that still stands at the shops in Albuquerque was hardly being used. They were using it for storage. These gigantic buildings, like 600 feet long and 250 feet wide and 100 feet tall, glass-walled shops, just incredible buildings. And by the end, they were really sitting as warehouses.
Okay, Mario Gonzalez had a few questions here. I think a few of them were answered, but let's check through here. Given all the dangerous work going on, were there many injuries or long-term illnesses that you uncovered as a result of your research that came about from the chemicals and gases and such that were used? Did you all delve into that much?
We didn't delve into it, but we do know from hospital records like asbestos was used in the engines, and that definitely affected the workers who tore apart the engines. Asbestos dust got in the air, and they had no respiratory equipment to prevent that. And then, as Richard said, their fingers getting caught, their arms getting caught, pieces flying, hitting them, pieces hitting them and crushing them. I mean, you almost could name it. Yeah. What happened down there.
Yeah, there were just infinite numbers of injuries that were possible, and it happened. And it was like, it would be more like, how bad does it have to be before you go to the hospital? Because there were injuries every day that were happening. So it was just a dangerous place to work. And if you sort of compound the materials that they're working with, those chemicals,
there are lye baths that they
lye
would
baths that they
stick the
put parts
pizza
in
to get the guck off, the grease, the
clean,
oil.
clean off, right?
So
All of those kinds of things, and then you combine that with greasy surfaces and oil, slippery things. It's just you can see it as a horror show.
An
really.
OSHA, super sight.
Right. Every day,
Yeah, it does
change.
sound dangerous. It sounds like they were getting paid for work that was pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
So you talked quite a bit at length about the impact of these shops on Hispanic families and sort of helping maybe boost up education, more access to income and opportunities. One of the questions that came up in the chat was talking about any links to maybe indigenous or Pueblo people in the area. How did they figure in to the shops?
There are several ways. There were individuals who were hired even early on in the shops, again at low levels of pay, but Pueblo men were hired even early on in the 1880s to work in the shops. But I think there's one unique thing that surprised us. We were not aware of it, even though I have done historical consultant work for the Pueblo of Laguna. It wasn't until doing this work on this book that we learned about a thing called the Watering the Flower Agreement, which was between the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad and the Pueblo of Laguna here in New Mexico. When the railroad came through, they got to Albuquerque in 1880 and immediately started on westward. And very soon, because Laguna is not that far away, and again on a water source, the Rio San Jose, they came to the boundary of the Laguna reservation, and the Lagunas stopped them. They blockaded their progress. And despite what the railroad had recently done at Santo Domingo, which Shirley described as just plowing right on through without permission, just laying down the track willy-nilly in like 3 days, crossing the reservation, nobody asked even the tribe yay or nay about doing this. When they got to Laguna, the Lagunas, and we don't know precisely how they were successful in blockading, but they were successful in blockading. And the railroad, surprisingly, sent a negotiating team out, and they negotiated with the Laguna people. And what they came up with was an agreement, which the Lagunas themselves called the Watering the Flower Agreement. It was an agreement that held from 1881 until 1963, never signed,
never written down, just a gentleman's handshake.
A handshake every year between one of the vice presidents of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad and the governor of Laguna Pueblo. And the agreement was that the railroad would be able to cross the reservation and use water from the Rio San Jose. In exchange, the railroad would promise to hire any member of the Laguna tribe to work on the railroad in perpetuity, forever.
So we love that Deb Holland's grandmother was one of those workers on the railroad. So
there have been many,
just even in her own family.
Many Pueblo people, especially from Laguna.
Especially, and Hopis and Zunis did it too.
Have worked for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. And to such an extent that in Laguna's case, there are satellite villages, even to this day, one in San Bernardino, California, another one in Alameda, California, that are considered to be part of Laguna Pueblo. They have regular intercourse with the home Pueblo at Laguna. They come back and to celebrate, ceremonial events, but they also do their own ceremonial events at those places still in San Bernardino and Alameda and Winslow, Arizona. So there are several that still are active. So it did have a big effect on some Pueblo people.